Most people think they know history. Meanwhile, half of what they learned in school is complete fiction that somehow got accepted as fact. These aren't small details or minor inaccuracies. These are massive lies that have shaped art, culture, politics, and our entire understanding of the past. Buckle up, because you're about to discover that history books are filled with more fiction than most novels. 1. Vikings never wore horned helmets. This iconic image comes from 19th century opera costumes, specifically Wagner's Ring Cycle productions, where costume designers thought horns looked more dramatic on stage. Real Viking helmets were simple, practical designs that wouldn't catch weapons or fall off during battle. The horned helmet myth has become so embedded in popular culture that it's shaped everything from football team logos to children's toys, despite being completely invented by theatrical costume departments centuries after Vikings existed. 2. Medieval people knew the Earth was round, not flat. The flat Earth myth was created by 19th century writers who wanted to make medieval people look ignorant compared to Renaissance explorers. Educated people in medieval Europe understood the Earth's spherical shape based on Greek scientific knowledge that never disappeared. Columbus's challenge wasn't convincing people the world was round, it was convincing them that Asia was much closer than it actually was, which is why he called Native Americans Indians when he realized he hadn't reached Asia as planned. 3. Napoleon wasn't short. He was 5'7", which was average height for his era. The short Napoleon myth comes from differences between French and English measurement systems, plus British propaganda cartoons that depicted him as tiny to mock his ambitions. His nickname Le Petit Caporal referred to his military rank, not his height. This myth has influenced everything from Napoleon complex psychology to countless jokes about short men compensating for their height, all based on a measurement conversion error and enemy propaganda. 4. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." This phrase doesn't appear in any historical records of her speeches or writings. The quote comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written when Marie Antoinette was still a child in Austria. Rousseau attributed the phrase to a great princess, but he was likely referencing folklore about previous French royalty. The cake myth has shaped how we view both Marie Antoinette and the French Revolution, creating a symbol of royal callousness that influenced revolutionary propaganda and still affects how we understand class conflict. 5. The Great Wall of China isn't visible from space with the naked eye. This myth persists despite being repeatedly debunked by astronauts who have actually been to space. The wall is narrow and made of materials that blend with the surrounding landscape, making it nearly impossible to distinguish from orbit without magnification. Even the International Space Station is too far away to see the wall clearly. This myth has influenced everything from trivia games to tourism marketing, creating false claims about human engineering achievements that sound impressive but aren't factually accurate. 6. Columbus didn't discover America, and he never set foot on North American mainland. Vikings reached North America 500 years before Columbus, and indigenous people had been living there for thousands of years before any European arrival. Columbus made 4 voyages to the Caribbean and South American coast, but never realized he hadn't reached Asia. The Columbus discovered America myth has shaped entire national narratives about exploration and colonization, while erasing indigenous history and achievements of earlier explorers. 7. Pilgrims didn't wear black and white clothing. They wore colorful fabrics and considered bright colors signs of wealth and status. The black and white image comes from 19th century illustrations and Thanksgiving pageants that depicted pilgrims in their Sunday church clothes, which were indeed more somber. Daily pilgrim clothing included reds, greens, browns, and yellows. This costume myth has influenced American holiday imagery and shaped how we visualize early colonial life, creating false impressions about Puritan attitudes toward color and decoration. 8. People in medieval times didn't die at age 30. Average life expectancy was low because of high infant mortality rates, but adults who survived childhood often lived into their 60s or 70s. The life expectancy 30 statistic includes all the babies who died in their first year, dramatically lowering the average. Medieval records show plenty of people living long lives, including many rulers and scholars who lived well into old age. This myth has shaped perceptions about historical quality of life and medical knowledge. 9. Cowboys didn't have gunfights at high noon in the American West. Most Western towns had strict gun control laws that required visitors to check their weapons with the sheriff. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral lasted only 30 seconds and was considered shocking because such violence was extremely rare. Hollywood Westerns created the gunfighter mythology that has nothing to do with actual frontier life, which was generally more peaceful and law-abiding than modern cities. 10. Ancient Romans didn't vomit at feasts to continue eating. The vomitorium was an architectural term for stadium exits, not dining rooms. This myth comes from misunderstanding Latin terminology and exaggerated stories about Roman decadence written by hostile Christian authors centuries later. Most Roman feasts were normal social gatherings with reasonable amounts of food and drink. The vomiting myth has influenced how we view Roman culture and ancient excess. 11. Einstein didn't fail mathematics in school. He mastered calculus before age 15 and was consistently excellent at math and physics throughout his education. This myth appears to come from changes in Swiss grading systems that confused later biographers. Einstein himself once said, "By the time I was 12, I had learned geometry from a school booklet. This booklet I found so fascinating that I read it through to the end." The failure myth has created false hope for struggling students, while misrepresenting how scientific genius actually develops. 12. Witches weren't burned at the stake in Salem. The Salem witch trials resulted in 20 executions, 19 by hanging and 1 by pressing with stones. Burning was the European method for executing witches, but it wasn't used in colonial America. This confusion has shaped American understanding of the Salem trials and influenced everything from literature to Halloween imagery, creating dramatic but historically inaccurate depictions of colonial justice. 13. Romans didn't use thumbs up or thumbs down to decide gladiator fates. This gesture system was invented by 19th century painters who needed visual symbols for their historical artwork. Historical records suggest that Roman crowds might have waved handkerchiefs or used other signals, but the thumb gestures are pure artistic invention. The thumbs up-down myth has become so embedded in popular culture that it influences how we think about Roman entertainment and decision-making. 14. Benjamin Franklin didn't discover electricity with a kite. Electricity was already known to science, and Franklin's kite experiment, if it happened as described, was designed to prove that lightning was electrical in nature. Flying a kite in a thunderstorm would likely have killed Franklin, so historians debate whether he actually performed the experiment or just described it theoretically. The kite myth has shaped American narratives about scientific discovery and Franklin's contributions to electrical knowledge. 15. George Washington didn't have wooden teeth. His dentures were made from gold, ivory, lead, and teeth from humans and animals, but not wood. The wooden teeth myth might have started because some of his ivory teeth became stained and looked wood-like. Washington's dental problems were well documented, but the materials used for his false teeth were much more sophisticated than wood. This myth has influenced depictions of Washington and colonial-era dentistry. 16. Lady Godiva didn't ride naked through Coventry to protest taxes. The naked ride story was added to existing legends about Lady Godiva centuries after her death, probably during the 13th century. The historical Godiva was a real 11th century noblewoman who made charitable donations, but the dramatic naked protest is pure medieval folklore. The myth has shaped everything from chocolate branding to discussions about tax protest and women's political power. 17. Iron maidens were never actually used as torture devices in medieval times. These spiked coffin-like devices were created in the 18th century by museums wanting to display dramatic medieval artifacts that would attract visitors. No historical records mention Iron Maidens, and they don't appear in any medieval torture manuals or execution records. The Iron Maiden myth has influenced how we view medieval justice and torture, creating false impressions about historical cruelty and punishment methods. 18. Abner Doubleday didn't invent baseball in Cooperstown in 1839. Baseball evolved from various bat and ball games played in America and England, with rules developing gradually over decades. Doubleday was fighting in the Mexican-American War when he supposedly invented baseball, and he never claimed credit for creating the sport. The Cooperstown myth was created in 1907 by a commission trying to establish baseball as uniquely American, despite evidence of the sport's international origins. 19. Paul Revere didn't yell, "The British are coming," during his midnight ride. He would have called them regulars or soldiers, since colonists still considered themselves British subjects. Revere was captured before completing his mission, and the warning was spread by multiple riders, not just one heroic figure. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1861 poem, Paul Revere's Ride, created the dramatic single-hero narrative that became more famous than the actual historical events. 20. Ancient Olympic athletes didn't compete naked because they celebrated the human body. They competed naked because clothing could provide advantages or become safety hazards during competition. The nudity rule developed after a runner's shorts fell off during a race, causing him to trip and fall. Olympic nudity was practical rather than philosophical, but later writers created elaborate theories about Greek attitudes toward the human form to explain the practice. 21. Nero didn't fiddle while Rome burned, because fiddles hadn't been invented yet. The violin wasn't developed until over 1,000 years after Nero's death. Historical records suggest Nero was in Antium, modern Anzio, when the fire started and returned to organize relief efforts. The fiddling myth comes from much later writers who wanted to portray Nero as indifferent to his people's suffering, but contemporary accounts describe his active involvement in fire relief efforts. 22. Medieval Europeans didn't refuse to bathe because they thought it was unhealthy. Public bathhouses were common in medieval cities, and people bathed regularly using basins and washcloths at home. The dirty medieval people myth was created by later periods that wanted to contrast their own civilization with earlier barbarism. Medieval people understood hygiene and cleanliness, though their methods differed from modern practices. This myth has shaped perceptions about medieval life and historical progress. 23. Betsy Ross didn't design the first American flag. The Betsy Ross story was first told by her grandson in 1870, nearly a century after the supposed event, with no contemporary evidence supporting his claims. The Continental Congress flag resolution from 1777 doesn't mention Ross or specify who should make flags. Multiple seamstresses and flag makers contributed to early American flag production, but Ross became the symbolic figure representing this collective effort through family storytelling and patriotic mythology. 24. Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian by ancestry. She was Macedonian Greek, descended from Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years while maintaining Greek culture and rarely intermarrying with native Egyptians. Cleopatra was probably the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language, though she spoke 9 languages total. Her Greek heritage has been obscured by Hollywood depictions and nationalist myths that present her as representing indigenous Egyptian culture. 25. Vikings didn't drink from skull cups. This myth comes from mistranslating Old Norse poetry that described drinking from curved branches of skulls, which meant drinking horns made from animal horns, not human skulls. Archaeological evidence shows Vikings used wooden cups, metal vessels, and animal horns for drinking, with no evidence of skull cups. The skull drinking myth has influenced how we visualize Viking culture and contributed to their barbaric reputation in popular media. 26. Medieval people didn't believe in dragons as real animals. Dragons in medieval literature were symbolic creatures representing evil, chaos, or spiritual challenges, not zoological specimens. Medieval bestiaries that included dragons clearly categorized them as allegorical rather than literal animals. Writers and artists understood the difference between symbolic and real creatures, but later readers interpreted medieval dragon stories as evidence of primitive scientific understanding, rather than sophisticated symbolism. 27. Spartacus wasn't fighting to end slavery. He was trying to escape Italy and return home to Thrace. The slave rebellion he led was initially an escape attempt that grew into a larger conflict when Roman armies tried to stop the fugitive slaves from leaving. Spartacus repeatedly tried to lead his followers out of Italy rather than establishing an anti-slavery revolution. His goals were personal freedom and return to his homeland, not social reform or abolition, though later movements adopted him as a symbol of anti-slavery resistance. 28. Medieval cathedrals weren't built by slave labor or oppressed peasants. They were community projects funded by donations and built by skilled craftsmen who were well paid for their specialized work. Cathedral construction provided employment for generations of stonemasons, carpenters, glassmakers, and other artisans who developed sophisticated techniques and formed powerful guilds. These projects represented massive community investments in both spiritual and economic terms, requiring complex financing and management systems. 29. Pirates didn't bury treasure on remote islands. Most pirates spent their money quickly in port cities on drinking, gambling, and supplies for future voyages. The few documented cases of buried treasure involved short-term storage during emergencies, not permanent hiding. The treasure-burying myth comes from Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island and other fiction that created romantic pirate imagery. Real pirates were more interested in converting stolen goods to cash than creating treasure maps and secret burial sites. 30. Thanksgiving wasn't celebrated annually by pilgrims, and the 1621 feast wasn't called Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims held occasional days of Thanksgiving for specific events, but their 1621 harvest celebration was a secular feast that lasted 3 days and included 90 Native Americans. The modern Thanksgiving holiday was established by Abraham Lincoln in 1863 and bears little resemblance to Pilgrim practices. The Thanksgiving myth has shaped American origin stories and influenced how we understand early colonial relationships with Native Americans. 31. Medieval Europeans didn't think tomatoes were poisonous because they were evil. Wealthy people got lead poisoning from eating acidic tomatoes off pewter plates. Tomatoes are acidic enough to leach lead from pewter, causing lead poisoning symptoms that people associated with tomato consumption. Poor people who ate from wooden plates had no problems with tomatoes. The tomato fear was based on legitimate health concerns about lead poisoning, not superstition about nightshade plants or demonic vegetables. 32. Ancient Egyptians didn't build pyramids using slave labor. They were constructed by paid workers who received regular wages, healthcare, and proper burials. Archaeological evidence shows pyramid workers lived in permanent communities with breweries, bakeries, and medical facilities. Worker tombs contain inscriptions indicating pride in their pyramid work, and their remains show evidence of medical care for work-related injuries. The workers ate meat regularly, which was expensive and wouldn't have been provided to slaves. Graffiti left by work gangs shows they had names like Friends of Khufu and competed with each other, indicating organized labor rather than forced bondage. The slave labor myth comes from biblical stories about Hebrew slavery in Egypt, not archaeological evidence about pyramid construction. Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after the pyramids were built, may have contributed to this myth, but his accounts mixed legend with historical observation. This myth has influenced everything from Hollywood epics to political rhetoric about oppression and labor rights, creating false narratives about ancient Egyptian society and the achievements of skilled workers who built some of humanity's most impressive monuments. The myth has also been used to diminish the engineering accomplishments of ancient Egyptians by suggesting the pyramids were built through brute force rather than sophisticated planning, mathematics, and skilled craftsmanship. 33. Medieval chastity belts weren't used to ensure women's fidelity during the Crusades. These devices were invented in the 19th century as curiosities for museums and private collectors who wanted to display medieval artifacts. No authentic medieval chastity belts exist in museum collections, and no medieval sources mention them. The chastity belt myth has influenced how we view medieval attitudes toward women and sexuality, creating false impressions about historical gender relations and sexual control. 34. Columbus didn't prove the Earth was round. Educated Europeans already knew this from ancient Greek calculations. Columbus's error was underestimating the Earth's size and overestimating Asia's eastward extension, making him think he could reach Asia by sailing west. The scholars who rejected his plan were actually correct about distances and geography. Columbus succeeded by accident when he encountered continents that Europeans didn't know existed, not by proving any geographical theories about Earth's shape. 35. Wild West towns didn't have lawless gunfights because most had stricter gun control than modern American cities. Towns like Tombstone and Dodge City required visitors to surrender their weapons to law enforcement upon arrival. Murder rates in frontier towns were often lower than in contemporary eastern cities, and most conflicts were resolved through legal systems rather than vigilante justice. Hollywood westerns created the lawless frontier myth that has influenced American attitudes toward guns, violence, and historical justice. 36. Medieval people didn't eat only bread and gruel. They had diverse diets including meat, fish, dairy, fruits, and vegetables, depending on social class and region. Medieval cookbooks describe elaborate recipes using dozens of spices and cooking techniques. Archaeological evidence from waste pits and kitchen remains shows varied diets that included exotic imported foods for the wealthy and locally produced variety for common people. The bread and gruel myth has shaped perceptions about medieval nutrition and quality of life. 37. Roman gladiators weren't usually slaves fighting to the death. Most were professional athletes who followed strict rules and safety protocols. Gladiator schools were expensive investments that owners protected by minimizing deaths and injuries. Most gladiator fights ended with submission rather than death, and successful gladiators could become wealthy celebrities. The fight to the death myth has influenced how we view Roman entertainment and ancient attitudes toward human life, creating false impressions about gladiatorial games. 38. Medieval people didn't get married at age 12. Average marriage ages were in the late teens or early 20s, similar to some modern societies. While noble families might arrange betrothal contracts for children, these marriages weren't consummated until both parties reached physical and social maturity. Church law prohibited marriage before age 12 for girls and 14 for boys, and most people married considerably later when they could support households independently. 39. George Washington didn't chop down a cherry tree and confess with, "I cannot tell a lie." This story was invented by Mason Weems, Parson Weems, in 1806 to teach children about honesty using Washington as a moral example. The cherry tree tale first appeared in the 5th edition of Weems's biography of Washington and was clearly presented as a moral parable rather than historical fact. This myth has influenced American character education and shaped how we understand Washington's personality and values. 40. Medieval people didn't believe the sun revolved around the earth because they were ignorant. This was the best scientific theory available based on observable evidence. Without telescopes, the geocentric model explained planetary motions and matched what people could observe about celestial movements. Ancient Greek astronomers had proposed heliocentric models, but they couldn't explain why stellar parallax wasn't visible, because stars are much farther away than anyone imagined. Medieval scholars worked with the best data and theories available to them. 41. Lightning doesn't strike the same place twice is completely false. Lightning frequently strikes the same locations repeatedly, especially tall structures and geographic features. The Empire State Building gets struck about 25 times per year, and lightning rods work precisely because lightning follows predictable patterns based on elevation and electrical conductivity. This myth has influenced both safety practices and popular sayings about probability and repeat occurrences, despite contradicting basic meteorological science. 42. Humans only use 10% of their brains is neurologically impossible. Brain scans show activity throughout the entire brain, even during simple tasks. Damage to any brain region causes noticeable deficits, proving that all areas serve important functions. This myth originated from early psychology experiments and was popularized by self-help authors promoting brain training and mental improvement programs. The 10% myth has influenced everything from educational theories to science fiction, despite being contradicted by decades of neuroscience research. 43. Goldfish don't have 3-second memories. They can remember things for months and can be trained to respond to different colors, sounds, and feeding schedules. Goldfish demonstrate complex learning behaviors and social recognition that would be impossible with 3-second memory spans. This myth probably comes from people justifying small fish bowls and minimal care for pet goldfish. The 3-second myth has influenced pet care practices and shaped attitudes toward fish intelligence and welfare. 44. People didn't believe you would fall off the edge of the earth if you sailed too far. Educated Europeans knew the earth was spherical and understood that ocean voyages were limited by supplies, navigation challenges, and weather, not by falling off edges. The flat earth belief was rare even in ancient times and wasn't a significant factor in age of exploration hesitations about long voyages. This myth has influenced how we understand historical attitudes toward exploration and geographical knowledge. 45, and finally, there's the myth that people in the past were less intelligent than modern humans. Archaeological and historical evidence shows that ancient and medieval people developed sophisticated mathematics, engineering, medicine, literature, and technology using the same intellectual capabilities we possess today. They solved complex problems, created lasting art and architecture, and developed scientific and philosophical ideas that still influence modern thinking. The primitive ancestors myth assumes that technological advancement equals intelligence advancement, ignoring the fact that human cognitive ability hasn't changed significantly in thousands of years. Medieval people who could memorize entire books, navigate by stars, and build cathedrals without modern tools demonstrated intellectual skills that many modern people couldn't match. The intelligence myth has shaped how we view historical progress and human development, creating false hierarchies between ancient and modern human capabilities. Here's the brutal truth about historical myths. They persist because they make better stories than complex reality. Most of these myths were created by people who wanted to make their own time period look more advanced, enlightened, or civilized by contrast. The biggest myth of all? That history is a steady progression from ignorance to knowledge, when in reality it's a complex mix of progress and regression across different cultures and time periods. The real tragedy is that these myths have robbed us of understanding how sophisticated, intelligent, and capable our ancestors actually were. Want to understand history? Start by questioning every fact that makes past people look stupid or primitive. Subscribe if you want to learn what actually happened instead of what makes good storytelling.